One of the hardest things to trace down in any programming language are logic errors. Now, last week we talked about the three types of errors: syntax errors, runtime errors, and logic errors. And we said that the first two were relatively easy to spot because the language stopped at a particular point and highlighted the line that was causing the problem. With logic errors, there's no such luck. So, for example, if I were to run this code here and I were to put in values, let's say 23 and 45, and I would expect a value somewhere in between there. For example, I would expect 34. I do a calculate average and I get 23. So obviously something is wrong with the program. However, it's not something where the line of code that's causing the problem is highlighted. So I'm going to close this out. And what we want to do is investigate this in a systematic way. Now, what a lot of people do is they just say, oh, well, let's just change this line. Let's just change this line. Well, normally that doesn't work in a big program. You need to investigate systematically what could be the problem. So one way in which you can start this investigation is to use something called a breakpoint. And the way, let me start by putting a breakpoint out on this line. The way I indicate that is I go all the way to the left, and in this little gray column out here, I click on it and notice that there's a red ball that shows up, and this line becomes highlighted. Now when I run the code and I put in 23 and 45 again, and I do calculate, it stops at that particular point in time. When it stops at that particular point in time, it stops before it runs that line. So notice the test 1 right now, and this is in something called the locals window. And if the locals window is not displaying for some reason, you can always get it to display by going up into debug, going into Windows, and you can do the locals window. This shows you all of the variables that are relevant to this particular part of the program. And so right here we displayed in the locals windows, we see the test 1 is 0. When we so we want to predict, we put 23 in test 1, and we want to predict what the test 1 variable is going to be, and we're expecting it hopefully to be 23. So we touch the F11 key, and touch the F11 key executes that particular line of code, and notice that test 1 is indeed 23. Now I press F11 again, and now I get to this next line of code, and I'm going to predict that since there was a 45 in the second one, the test 2 will be 45. And I press F11, and uh-oh, there's a problem. It's 23. So now I expected it to be 45 and it's 23. So I want to look at that particular line of code, and I notice, hey, yes, there is a problem here. This test 1 should have been test 2. So so basically I think I can now drag this line of code. So I've made that little change, and sometimes it won't let you make changes, but it did let me make that change, which was nice. So I drug the little yellow arrow up so I can execute that line one more time. And so when I execute that line of code, and I'll press F11, now test 2 is 45. So I'll just press F11 again just to see. I should get the average of those things, which I said before should be 34, and the average is 34. And then I finally display it out to the window here. I can continue from this point by pressing the continue or pressing F5, and that will continue on the program, and I see that I get the correct results. So there are more complicated ways that I can do debugging, but this is a very simple way of doing debugging using breakpoints and the locals window.